I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not, but there was a very famous television program, probably before most of you were born, called the Twilight Zone, 60s, the last century, and it was a kind of science fiction-y thing. And I just like the title because it captures something of the metaphor, if you like, that I want to use, which is that there is a kind of in-between zone in language description, which has only until recently been underexploited. So I want to look at that twilight zone, the zone between grammar and Lexus, and look at the practical applications of the existence of this twilight zone during the course of this talk. We've got an hour all told. I'm hoping that the presentation will take 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions. So please post questions into the chat, and my assistants, including Anne, will gather the questions and make sure that they get addressed at the end. So let's have a look. Traditionally, you'll be familiar with this kind of layout of a typical course book, where there's a distinction between, on the one hand, vocabulary, and on the other hand, grammar, as if the two were completely separate. But of course, we know that there's a problem here, because where do we put, for example, phrasal verbs, which is sort of vocabulary, but of course they have their own associated grammar, separability, transitivity, and so on. Where do they go? And do they go into the vocabulary box? Do they go into the grammar box? Similarly, with expressions like go plus ing, as in go shopping, or go sightseeing, or go skydiving, or go scuba diving. It's grammatical and says there's a structure there, but these things are often put into the vocabulary box because they represent a kind of topic associated with free time activities. But is that the best place for them? And then what about discourse markers like by the way, or I mean, or you know, or and that sort of thing, and that sort of thing. Yeah, these kind of fixed expressions which we use frequently, particularly in spoken language, but also there are discourse markers in written language, and they're often more than one word. Fairly idiomatic, like by the way. Where do they go? Do we put them in the vocabulary box or into the grammar box? And finally, there's a whole set of expressions that are sort of grammatical, but they're not typical grammar, like the more the merrier, or all being well, if I were you. They allow a degree of substitution, the bigger the better, for example, all things being equal, and so on, but they're not grammar as we typically know it. They're much more restricted in their kind of generalizability. So we have this problem. It's a problem that's been recognized for some considerable time, going back to the work of people like John Sinclair in the 1990s, when they started looking at corpora, that is to say, corpuses of naturally occurring language. And it occurred to Sinclair that the language user has available to him or her a large number of what he called pre-constructed phrases. Pre-constructed phrases that can constitute single choices. They're like words. It's something you pull down off the shelf, but they're more than words. They're phrases, and they seem to be pre-constructed or prefabricated. We can analyze them into, like all being well, for example, we can analyze them into their segments, but it doesn't seem to be what we do psychologically. We pull them down as complete chunks. We see this happening very much when we look at spoken data. This is a transcript of 2 adult Australians talking about their children, and you can see a number of pre-constructed units here, if you think about it. So they're saying they were awake at 5:30, Stefan. Yeah, it's way too early after a night like that they had last night. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you live and learn. And sometimes you don't live and learn. Sometimes you live and repeat and repeat and repeat. Change of subject. Would you like a cup of tea? No, thanks. Oh, I'm sick of that alarm going off all the time. Yeah. What can you do? So if we look at that, if we analyze that, we can see that at least these underlying expressions constitute what we might call prefabricated chunks. Yeah, way to as opposed to very. That's right. Expressions, discourse markers like that. Expressions, phrases like you live and learn. We use that all the time, but we never say you learn and live, or you live but you learn. I mean, you can say that, but we don't. We pull that idiom down off the shelf, and then we can play with it as the speaker does in the next line. And sometimes you don't live and learn. Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a cup of tea? Is, according to the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English, published in 1999, it's based on a corpus of British English, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the longest 7, or the most common 7-word chunk in the English language, or it was then in 1999. Would you like a cup of tea? And so on. So we see a huge amount of this conversation is composed of what we assume is pre-constructed chunks. And this is some of the statistics that have been quoted. Up to 52% of writing and nearly 60% of speech consists of these multi-word combinations or chunks, prefabricated units, whatever you want to call them. 60% of speech and almost as much of writing. So they constitute a very important area of language, such that some writers, going way back to 1976 in this case, surmise that speakers do as much remembering as they do putting together. That is to say, we're not simply always putting together sentences out of words which slot into grammatical categories. We are remembering whole chunks, whole expressions, prefabricated units, which we pull down off the shelf. And it's only recently that we've had statistical data to tell us which of these chunks are more frequent than others. And this, for example, comes from a really useful website, which is Norbert Schmidt's website. Norbert Schmidt is a researcher at University of Nottingham in the UK, and has written extensively on formulaic language. And this is a sample from a huge list of all the multi-word units that occur in their corpus. This is going way down the list to items 2744, etc. And you can see there's some, even then, quite common recognizable expressions. So when this distinction then between vocabulary and grammar seems to be a kind of artificial one, because it doesn't take account necessarily of the twilight zone, the zone between both vocabulary and grammar, which we've seen constitutes a large proportion of spoken and written language. Michael Halliday said perhaps this distinction is really, it's a difference of perspective, that Lexus and grammar, that is to say vocabulary and grammar, are not different phenomena, they're the same phenomena, but they're looked at from different ends. Yeah? It's the same form, it's linguistic data. But if we look at it from one end, we see vocabulary. If we look at the other end, we see grammar. It's the same thing. And of course, those of you who have done your homework will be familiar with the lexical approach, which has been around for some considerable time now. These were two important books that came out in the 1990s on the so-called lexical approach, which attempted to shift the balance away from an obsession with grammar onto vocabulary, lexis, including chunks. Why? Because it was hypothesized, and there's good evidence to suggest that chunks are really, really useful in terms of fluency, in terms of what we call idiomaticity. I'll explain that in a second. And also, ironically, in the acquisition of grammar. In terms of fluency, it's clearly more time-saving if you can pull down from your mental lexicon a chunk, a multi-word unit, rather than construct it out of individual words. If we look at corpus data, here are some of the common 5-word chunks in English. You know what I mean? 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 I mean, why bother constructing that from bottom up? You know what it takes so long. So in terms of fluency, the longer the chunk and the more the chunks you have, the more fluent you are going to sound, because you won't be pausing so often. So chunks contribute to fluency. They also contribute to what we call idiomaticity. By idiomaticity, I don't mean idioms so much, although idioms come into it, but idiomaticity is what people say, what people most frequently think of the time. Think of how many ways and how many languages you could say this. Yeah? The big hand on 8 and the little hand nearly on 9. I mean, how do you say it in Arabic? How do you say it in French? How do you say it in Chinese? There's lots of different ways of saying it. We could say it's 20 to 9, which we do say in English, but we could say it's 9 less 20, or it's 2/3 past 8, or it's 40 past 8, or it exceeds 8 by 40, or it's 1/3 to 9. Okay? Or it's 10 minutes after 8:30. We can say all these things. They're all grammatical. They're grammatically correct, but people just don't say them. They're not idiomatic. That's what we mean by idiomaticity. So chunks give us a feel, and our listeners a feel for natural spoken language. Now, the third thing I mentioned that chunks do is that they supply grammar. They supply grammar, if you like, for free. This is something that Michael Lewis, in one of his books on the lexical approach, referenced, he mentioned without developing in any detail. But this is what he says. The lexical approach claims that far from language being the product of the application of rules, that is to say grammatical rules, most languages acquired lexically, that is to say in the form of vocabulary, then broken down, after which it becomes available for reassembly in potentially new combinations. Do you get that? Well, let's have a look at an example. This is from some research that Rod Ellis did way back on a 11-year-old boy, I think he was, whose first language was Gujarati. And over 11 months, Rod Ellis tracked the development of his second language, English. And he noticed that he used this expression, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. He put it at the beginning or the end of utterances. That one, I don't know. I don't know what's this. Yeah. So he's using it as a formulaic chunk, which was unanalyzed. But over time, he started to detach the I don't and join it with other verbs. I don't understand. I don't like. And then over a bit more time, he was able to detach the no from the negative auxiliary and create affirmative sentences of the type, I know this, I know. Yeah, but I don't know came first. And then later on, I know this. And then even more time, he was able to detach the pronoun and substitute another one. So he was, after 11 months, was able to produce fully grammatical sentences of the type, you don't know where it is. You see what's happening here? So he's taking on board a chunk. He's taking on board as a chunk. He's using it as a chunk. And then over time, it's being broken down and then reassembled. So this is the argument that grammar, maybe a lot of grammar, particularly in the first language, comes out of breaking down and reassembling these kinds of chunks. One really good reason for, if you're teaching even beginners, to teach lots of expressions like, I don't know, I don't understand, can you repeat it? How do you spell it? How do you pronounce it, etc. All these useful expressions that they can use again and again and again in the classroom. And hopefully these expressions will unpack their grammar over time. Because as Rod Ellis himself says in a recent book, the prevailing view today is, in 2014, is that learners unpack the parts that comprise a sequence and in this way discover the second language grammar. In other words, formulaic sequences serve as a kind of starter pack from which grammar is generated. And they're not taught the grammar, and then they put words in, they're taught expressions, they memorize expressions, and these expressions become a starter pack for the acquisition of grammar. Okay, so how as teachers do we operationalize this twilight zone, if you like? And this is where I want to reference an article I wrote for Cambridge, a paper which is available free online, where I look at 4 different approaches to teaching the twilight zone, teaching this in-between zone between vocabulary and grammar. There's the reference. I'll give it to you at the end. But I'm just going to summarize in the time I've got left these 4 different approaches and give you some examples. And of these, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with. So I call them the phrasebook approach, the awareness raising approach, the analytic approach, and the communicative approach. Okay, the phrasebook approach. You know what a phrasebook is? I mean, a phrasebook is what we buy when we're traveling to a foreign country and we don't have time to learn the language, and it gives us a list of useful phrases. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, particularly if you memorize some of these useful phrases. So a phrasebook approach is one which involves things like the rote learning of formulaic expressions. And that could involve repetitive practice, as in drilling. It could also involve what's called shadowing, which is when you listen to something or you're watching a YouTube video and you hear a useful expression and you repeat it. Yeah, or you repeat as much as possible of what you hear, and that will include some lexical chunks, some expressions. Good learners do this instinctively, but we need to train our learners on how to do it in the classroom so they can do it when they're at home watching a movie. And then jazz chants, and I'll give you some examples of that in a second. Let's look at learning of formulaic expressions. Rote learning. Rote learning means learning by heart, memorizing. Doesn't have a very good press in the literature on second language teaching at the moment. But if you go back 100 years, Harold Palmer, who was the grandfather of applied linguistics, it occurred to him that memorization was incredibly important. He was asked, what is the most fundamental guiding principle to conversational fluency? What is the, if you had to boil it down to one principle, what would it be for fluency, for proficiency? And he said this: memorize perfectly the largest number of common and useful word groups. And keywords there, memorize. It's a memory job. There are a lot of, we saw a list, we're in 2,944. There's a lot of expressions out there. How are you going to learn them? You're going to have to memorize them. And not just sort of more or less, but perfectly. Yeah, we saw, for example, with you live and learn. You live and learn. It's never you learn and live, or you live but learn, or you live and then you learn. No, it's you live and learn. You live and learn, you live and learn, you live. You can say it's like 20 to 9. We could say it's 10 past a third of an hour, but we don't. We say 20 to 9. You live and learn, all things being well, etc. And then the largest number of common and useful. Well, common, in 1925, Harold Palmer didn't know what were the most common word groups. Now we know, because we have the data from corpus linguistics. There's no reason why we shouldn't teach the most common ones earlier than the least common. People used to teach, we'll teach idioms. We'll teach, it's raining cats and dogs. It's raining cats and dogs. That's an idiom in English. Yeah, it's an idiom, but nobody ever says. So it's not common, and it's not very useful, particularly if you live in Kuwait. Word groups, not individual words, but word groups, phrases, chunks, combinations, collocations. I remember when I was visiting Japan, I would see teenagers on the subway memorizing whole books of individual words, the 10,000 most useful words in English, they were called. But words like elephant, piano, pusillanimous, etc. No, word groups. That's what they should be memorizing. So that's what Palmer said 100 years ago, and it's still good advice now. Here's some, I mentioned I mentioned jazz chants. Here's an example from a Cambridge book, excellent book, totally recommend, Lexical Grammar by Leo Sullivan, packed with activities. This is one of them. It's a chant. Yeah, so a very low-level chant where you have one group, one half of the class, the other half of the class. You have this projected, and they chant it. It's a dialogue. We're using invitation or offering language. Tea or coffee? I'm not bothered. Milk or sugar? I don't mind. How would you like it? Over it comes. Here you go. You're so kind. Yeah, all of those are very common expressions, formulaic expressions in idiomatic English. I'm not bothered. And you can create these yourself. You can create them by looking at any list of chunks or strings. I showed you this one before, the top 5 word clusters, the 20 top 5 word clusters in English. Just take some of these, take the ones that sort of make sense, I know what you mean, etc., and make a chart. Yeah, one half of the class, other half of the class, one student and their partner. I was going to say, at the end of the day, you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. To be honest with you, I know what you mean. This, that, and the other at the end of the day. Okay, it doesn't make sense, but it's kind of fun, and it's like a rap. Or a funny thing happened. What happened? A funny thing happened to Lee. It's funny how things like that happen. The same thing happened to me. An awful thing happened. What happened? An awful thing happened to Jim. It's awful how things like that happen. The same thing happened to him, and so on. Yeah? Useful ways of learning formulaic language through repetition, but in this case, not drilling, but chants. Okay, the awareness raising approach. This is approach number 2. And this involves extensive reading and listening, preferably using authentic material. Why authentic material? Because authentic material is more likely to reach that like 60% we saw figure of formulaic language. Whereas material that's been written specifically for learners doesn't necessarily include a lot of chunk language because, it might be difficult, all these idiomatic expressions. And then an activity I'll show you in a minute called chunking text, and then having learners recycle chunks in their own text, either spoken or written. Here's an example of an authentic text. It's a joke. It's not very funny, but it's authentic and it's short. A girl was taking her little brother for a walk in the park. Can I go and run along the top of that wall? He asked her. No, said the sister. Go on, insisted the little boy. Well, okay, she said, but if you fall off and break both your legs, don't come running to me. You get it? Kind of, well, it's a kid's joke. But if we look at that, we see it's full of chunks. And we can ask the learners to find these. So to take somebody for something, to take a little brother for a walk. Yeah, it's a kind of what we call a construction. It's a fixed structure with variable slots. You can take the dog for a walk. You can take a little brother for a walk. You can take your friend for a run, or you can take your horse for a swim. But it's a common construction. Go and run. Okay, this is really common. Go and run. Go and see. Go and ask. Go and tell. When do we ever teach that? Incredibly frequent chunk in English. Again, with a variable slot. Could be come and see. Yeah, but come and see. Go and run. It's a chunk. The top of that wall. The top of that wall, incredibly, the middle of the room, the end of the day, etc. Very, very, very common sequence or string or cluster, if you like, in English. Go on, insisted the little boy. Go on. We've seen phrasal verbs. And another one, fall off. Yeah. And then come running. Yeah. A verb with come running, come shopping, come sightseeing, come dancing, Yeah, it's a common combination. And then this expression, don't come running to me, there's a whole expression which is actually very common. Don't come ing to me. If we look at a corpus, this is a corpus of movie English, corpus of language that's used in movies, and you'll see that this combination of don't come plus ing to me is really, it's kind of common. And don't come running to me is the second most common expression. Don't come crying to me, don't come complaining. So in other words, it has a particular pragmatic function. Go on, go down, go through. This is a wonderful website, the Scale website. You just type in go and it'll show you all the different phrases, phrasal verbs that are formed by go. And the order of frequency, go on is the most frequent. And we can get examples by asking it to give us examples, and they're nice, easy examples that even students understand, but they are authentic. There is usually something interesting going on. So we can explore these. Now, I've said you can give the text to students and they can find the chunks, but it's not easy. It's actually very difficult. If you're not already had a lot of exposure of the language, it's very difficult to see chunks, even when they're right in front of you. It's a bit like, I use the analogy of the sky at night, where it's difficult to see the constellations, these different, Scorpio, Aquarius, Capricorn, etc., unless somebody points them out to you. And it's the same with chunks, unless somebody points them out to you. Leo Sullivan, in his book, has a nice idea. I'll show you in a minute. But you can train learners to look for chunks by showing them that there are typical structures with chunks. So if you look for example, adjective plus noun, or noun plus noun, or noun plus of plus noun, you'll find what probably will be chunks, or preposition plus noun phrase at the moment, in the end, at the top, or adverb and adjective combinations, completely wrong, densely populated, highly unlikely, or phrasal verbs, or these combinations with very common verbs often and a noun phrase: make a point, launch a campaign, cause damage, have a break, have lunch, take a rest, etc. And finally, noun plus noun or adjective plus adjective pairs, as in fish and chips, sweet and sour, safe and sound, and so on. So if we show learners that these combinations are common, maybe they can find the chunks in the text themselves. Leo Sullivan has a really nice idea where you don't ask the learners to find the chunks, you show them, you highlight the chunks in the text. There's their authentic text with the chunks at any time. The company was founded, these expressions, etc. Set up your own business, buy plane. They study the text, and then you take the text away, and then they have to try and, from memory, retrieve as many of the chunks that they can remember. So the chunking is done by the teacher, but the memorizing is done by the learners. Okay, we're getting on to the analytic approach now, the third approach. And this is maybe for slightly higher levels, where we start to look at what in the literature is called what motivates particular metaphors. So for example, if we look at, there's a group of metaphors or figurative uses of language in English which derive from or are motivated by horses, reference to horses. So we give free rein to an idea. We spur on our favorite football team. We talk about galloping inflation. Now, all these expressions, rein, spur, gallop, of course, derive from the world of horse racing or horses. And we have hundreds of domains like this in English, as in any language. There's a lot of language in English which relates to seafaring, going to sea. There's a lot of language that relates to football. There's a lot of language relates to other areas. And so drawing attention to these and grouping these may help learners notice them and then hopefully remember them and use them. Noticing patterns of sound repetition. A lot of these binomials that we looked at before tend to be have repeated sounds. Yeah, so short and sweet. They both begin with a sibilant. Yeah, safe and sound, sweet and sour. Or there's a rhyme, take a break, make a date. Again, drawings, I mean, more than you would expect of these two-word expressions have some kind of sound harmony or sound repetition. And this helps for memory training. We learn these together, the effect can be mutually enhancing. And again, frequent recycling and review. When we say analytic, it's not just about metaphors, it's also about, for example, the figurative use of grammatical items like prepositions. So why do we say they're in love, not they're on love? Why do we say the train is in time? No, we don't. We say the train is on time, not in time. Why do we say I'm on the phone? What's the difference between you're in the way and I'm on my way? Why do we say the house is on fire, not in fire? We're in luck, not on luck, and we arrive just in time. Well, this is where we need to go back to the original meaning of these prepositions in terms of how they describe space. And then we can see there's a sort of analogy here. So when, for example, we use in, it's typically with three-dimensional containers. So they're in love. We're thinking of love as being a kind of container, and we're in it. Not on top of it, we're in it. Whereas the train is on time, we're thinking of time here as a kind of line, and the train is somewhere along it, or a surface, if you like. So making that distinction between volume and surfaces, in and on, can help, arguably, can help learners make sense of these idiomatic uses of prepositions. Here's another more complicated one. Look at these expressions. And these are all authentic examples plus of a verb plus a possessive plus the word way. What do they have in common? Costa made his way to the car. Fernando elbowed his way to the front of the crowd. Rudd pushed his way to the front of the group. As he clawed his way to the pinnacle of power, the two clubs fought their way. He and his compatriots, number 6, wormed their way. What have they got in common? Well, they all imply some kind of difficulty. Yeah, there's a bit force involved. That's the important thing. He didn't walk to the car, he made his way to the car. Fernando didn't go to the front of the crowd, he elbowed his way. Now, which of these examples are metaphorical? Well, clearly he elbowed his way, he clawed his way, he wormed his way. These are using metaphorical language. He didn't literally claw his way to the pinnacles of power, but these are very common expressions. So having identified their basic meaning, have separated them into literal and figurative, we can then ask learners to think of different situations in which a combination might be appropriate. To crawl your way to something, to cry your way, to sneeze, to lie, to feel, etc. So this is a way of analyzing the semantics, if you like, of these kinds of idioms. Finally, the communicative approach. This is really using and including and designing activities that have formulaic expressions as part of them, and that these formulaic expressions are constantly repeated. And this, as we've seen before, develops fluency, but also helps memorizing. And if you think about it, many common games that we do in the classroom involve the repetition of formulaic expressions. So, for example, think of a guessing game, like guessing an object. Okay, I've got something here. You can. This is a good one to do online. I've got something here on my desk. You can't see it. You've got to guess what it is by asking yes/no questions. Yeah? So I can write up some of the questions on the board, some constructions, or I can project them like this, that you can use to guess the object. Is it made of? Can you with it? Yeah. Can you write with it? Can you eat with it? Is it for writing? Is it for eating? Is it the same size as? Is it the same size as a football? Is it the same size as a mobile phone? And so on. Lots of useful, really useful language here that the students use again and again and again. So they ask the teacher, and the teacher demonstrates the activity by eliciting lots of questions, answering the questions until the students get, here it is, here's the item. Oh, that's a coffee cup. Yeah, it's a nice one though, handmade with a bee on it. And then I can tell you the story about it, but I'm not going to because you don't have time. That's, even most basic levels can do that kind of activity. Here's another one. Picture, I'm one person in this picture. You've got to find out who I am. You've got to use the construction. Are you the person who? Are you the person who is riding the bike? Yeah. Are you the person who is sitting on the mat? And so on. Yeah? So you give them the structure. They repeat, lots of repetition. Here's another one. Students in groups generate as many sentences as possible using one of us can. One of us can speak French. One of us can drive a car. Two of us can make pizza, and so on. They generate their sentences. How they're going to do that? They're going to have to ask questions to each other. They write down their sentences. They report their sentences to the class. You can do this online. They can do it in the breakout room. They come back. They report their sentences. You say, well, that's grammar, isn't it? Yeah, it's grammar. But if we can start to play around and add slightly more complex structures here, which are lexical. One of us has never, two of us have never, and so on and so on, or used to, or one of us is looking forward to the end of term break. Yeah, two of us are looking forward to graduating, and so on. Yeah, as many sentences as you can, use a dictionary. Repetition. And of course, this reminds a classic activity, which you all know and love, which is the find someone who, where students are interviewing each other and they've got to make notes about, on the basis of the survey, find someone in the class who has, for example, eaten octopus, has seen an eclipse, has been in a helicopter. They go around, they ask you questions. What are they doing? They're using a structure, but it's a structure which is essentially lexical. Have you? Have you ever? Have you ever eaten octopus? Have you ever seen an eclipse? Have you ever? Have you ever? Have you ever? Have you ever? You get they ask the questions, they get their answers, they report them, and every stage of the activity, they're repeating, have you ever, which is a really useful chunk. And finally, preparing for dialogues or presentations. When I was recently, when I was doing live talks, I gave a talk in Spanish, because I live in Spain, to a group of teachers. There I am. And I'm not used to doing this. I prefer to do talks in English, but these were Spanish-speaking teachers and so. So what did I do? I planned and I planned and I planned. And what did I plan? I didn't plan. Yeah, okay, I planned the talk, but I planned the expressions that I was hoping to use in the talk. I planned these expressions. I looked them up. I wrote them down. And there are some of them. Now, I wrote them down. I put them onto cards, Spanish on one side, English on the other. And anytime I had a free moment, I tested myself. So aquí se puede ver. here you can see, like pointing to the PowerPoint, aquí se puede ver, and so on. A mí me parece, seems to me, primer lugar, and so on and so on. So these expressions really helped me because of all the reasons we've said. They gave me a degree of fluency. And it's easier to produce aquí se puede ver as an expression than to try and construct it from scratch. They sound idiomatic. And over time, maybe that helped my Spanish grammar as well. Some researchers did exactly this with dialogues. They asked students to anticipate situations they would be in using English. Now, these could be travel situations, they could be social situations, they could be shopping situations, etc. Ideally, nearer rather than later, sooner rather than later. Yeah? So there's a certain amount of relevance and urgency. They had learners prepare dialogues for these situations. First of all, by looking for useful expressions. They wrote the dialogues, they included these expressions, they practiced the dialogues. And the researchers found that, unsurprisingly, and here is their summary of their research, the subjects reported finding the use of memorized sentences, these that they'd prepared in these anticipated conversations, that is to say, conversations they were anticipating doing at some point. They found the use of memorized sentences a liberating experience because it gave them exposure to an opportunity to sound native-like, that is to say, they're idiomatic. It promoted their fluency, that is to say, they're faster, and it reduced the panic, the stress of online production and stressful encounters. It gave them a sense of confidence about being understood and provided material that could be used in other contexts too. Not just for this particular situation, but in other contexts. So that was the result of that survey. So there are my 4 approaches to crossing the Twilight Zone. And there's the reference, if you're interested, which is really just a summary of this talk. And we are now at the end. So I'll stop my share, and if there's any questions, then I'll see if I can address them.
Okay, here is the first question. Are prepositions classified as vocabulary or grammar?
That's a very good question, because if you think about prepositions never, I mean, the definition of a preposition is really it's the first part of a prepositional phrase. Prepositions don't exist on their own. We don't go around saying in, of, away. No, prepositions, like most language, exist in context. And the context of a preposition is typically a noun phrase in the corner, on top of the wall, etc. So we could say, well, yeah, they're a very good example of where grammar and vocabulary kind of meet. They're the same thing, but we can look at it from 2 perspectives. We can look at them as items of grammar, as functional words, as opposed to content words, or we could look at them as items of vocabulary as part of typically noun phrases. And noun phrases, part of prepositional phrases, that is to say, preposition plus a noun phrase, which are incredibly common in English and very, very useful to express a whole range of meanings. So yes, I would say it depends again which way you look at them. You look at them from one end, the vocabulary. You look at the other end, they are grammar. And that's the same with a lot of grammar, really. I mean, verbs, nouns, I mean, nothing exists on its own. Words have associated structures, and structures are typically used with certain words. So that's the point, really. It's not one thing or the other. Any other questions there, Anne?
Yes. Our next question is, could you clarify the difference between chunks and collocations?
Yeah, I mean, the literature on this area is very diverse in the sense that you'll find different writers prefer different expressions. And in fact, the term chunk is not commonly used by academics. It's considered to be a little bit unscientific. And so we get expressions like prefabricated units, multi-word expressions, we get formulaic language, etc. Lots and lots of different ways of saying the same thing. Now, collocations, I would say, are a sense a subclass of the bigger class of chunks. And we say chunks are anything, any combination of words that occur with more than random frequency. Then collocations are a subset of those. Collocations are typically words that co-occur in, again, more than random, with more than random frequency, and typically two words. So we know that a typical collocation of wide is a wide street, as opposed to broad. We talk about a broad-shouldered person or a broad accent or whatever. So broad and wide, whereas they are synonyms, but they tend to be used with different nouns. And so those would be collocations, a sort of subset, if you like, of chunks, but certainly not to be ignored, because they, again, form a very important part of what we've called idiomaticity. And we saw some examples with, highly, for example, adverbs plus adjectives, highly populated, densely populated, highly probable, etc. These are, it's not wrong to say very probably, but we just say highly probable more often than we say very probable. So yeah, collocations as being a kind of chunk, absolutely. And
okay, the next question is, if I can get it here. I'm trying to open it up and I'm not doing very well here to see what happened to mine. Okay, do you mean we should only use common chunks?
Well, I mean, there's so many chunks, there's so many combinations, there's so many multi-word phrases, there's whole dictionaries of them, there's dictionaries of collocations, there's dictionaries of, we saw online dictionaries of multi-word units, etc. So which ones do you teach? Well, I think basically it comes down to two things. One is teach those which are most useful soonest. Yeah, so this will depend on the learners and what kind of context they're in. If they're engineers, for example, or if they're studying English for academic purposes, or if they are business people, then we can teach the kinds of expressions or chunks that are associated with their particular professional domain. On the other hand, if we don't know what their professional domain is, they don't have one because they're younger learners, they're just learning general English, then really the only organizing principle that I think is the most viable one is frequency. What are the most common? What are the most frequent? Of course, there are expressions which you can use in the classroom. We've seen that will be frequent in the classroom and are worth teaching. And I always think it's a greater, I like going into classrooms and seeing on the wall lots of different expressions that are available for learners to use in the classroom, like, can you spell that? How do you pronounce that? Can you repeat that, etc. Really, really, really useful language, because, as I said before, theoretically, this kind of language might feed into their developing grammatical competence. But in the absence of knowing what is useful, then teach what is common. We used to know what was common, but we do have that information at our fingertips through the kinds of resources based on corpora that I've been showing you. Now, and this information is percolating into standard textbooks for teaching general English. The writers of textbooks tend to choose collocations, expressions which are more common rather than less common. And certainly we've moved a long way from teaching expressions like it's raining cats and dogs, for example, which, as I said before, nobody ever says. Thank you,
Okay.
Annie. Other questions?
Our fourth question is, given that learning strategies are so hugely important in language teaching, why is it that they are rarely employed in the classroom?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and it's a relevant question too to what we're talking about, because if we assume that the vocabulary load for learners is huge, I mean, just of individual words, it's in the several thousand. If they want to approach anything like IELTS level, they're going to need a vocabulary, both a receptive and a productive vocabulary of several thousand words, of which many will be word combinations. Then how are they going to get that mental lexicon? They're not going to get it in the classroom. There isn't time, even on intensive courses, to teach learners all the words that they'll need. So they're going to have to do it on their own. And this is where learner training is so critical. Training learners how to become good learners of vocabulary, and particularly of multi-word units. How do you do that? Well, first of all, yeah, you train them, you show them that these are important, that they're common. And you can demonstrate that very easily by using text, as I said with my example, it's way too early for you live and learn, etc. Showing how common these chunks are in real English, naturally occurring English, both written and spoken. And then you need to show them how they can identify these, and how they can record these, and how they can learn these through activities like I did before my presentation in Spanish, was using word cards, writing the Spanish on one side, the English on the other, and testing myself constantly. Yeah, carrying around an envelope full of about 10, 20, 30 word cards at a time, and testing myself, and then getting rid of those that I knew, and then adding new ones that I didn't. And that's learner training. We can start showing learners how to do that in the classroom, and we can also introduce them to apps like Quizlet, Anki, etc., which save them the trouble of actually writing. I like pieces of paper personally, but if they like apps, then show them where the apps are and encourage them to use them. But it's all about learner training. You're absolutely right. And it's the only way that learners are going to achieve the degree of vocabulary knowledge which is necessary to pass exams later on. Tell them that, and that's an incentive.
Okay, our next question is, what suggestions do you have for books to read more about today's topic?
Right. Well, I mean, I mentioned Leo Sullivan's book on lexical grammar, published by Cambridge University Press, an assessment, which came out in 2018. And that's packed with practical ideas for teaching lexical chunks, collocations, etc. And Leo is practicing teacher and teacher trainer. He's not just an academic. So it's a really, really practical book, as are all books in that series, which I have to declare an interest. I am the editor of. But there are other more academic books on the topic of formulaic language and also of corpus linguistics. I mean, if I could reach into my I've mentioned Michael Lewis and the Implementing the Lexical Approach, not a new book, but that's a standard one. And I mentioned Norbert Schmidt. So if you're interested in, this is a very readable book. It's in a new edition now, published by Cambridge, Vocabulary and Language Teaching, which talks about formulaic language. And this book, published by Oxford, How Vocabulary is Learned by Stuart Webb and Paul Nation, is a newish book. And that is also mentions learning a formulaic language quite often. So these are, as I say, slightly more academic books, but these are not difficult academic books. but good question. Anne, have you got any more questions up your sleeve?
We have time for only one more question because we have to stay on schedule. The last question is, should we use chunks in teaching lower levels only or with higher levels?
All levels, and the sooner the better. And I think there's a tendency to focus more on individual words at lower levels because they're considered easier and more frequent. But when you think about it, a lot of the language we use in the classroom is chunk language. When we think, think of the instructions we give students: stand up, sit down, put it away, write this down. They're all phrasal verbs, and they're really, 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 really useful. And I think that the more often we use this kind of language at the lower levels, the more they will get used to it and hopefully take some of it on board. So it's never too early to start, and you just keep increasing the amount of lexical language that you teach. Somebody just asked a question actually about this book, which I wrote, which is it's a book based on the most common words in English, in this case, more, in and out, need, modal verbs, etc., and the chunks that they're associated with. That book I would recommend too, except it's no longer in print. So sorry about that, but you may find a copy, if you're lucky, in a local secondhand bookshop. And I think that's all we've got time for, Anne.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining us, Scott. I think we all have learned stuff that we can use in our classrooms. Again, thank you so much. And thank you to the people who actually joined us. We will break for prayer break and lunch. Please plan on being back for the 12:45 session. And that will be with another Cambridge author, Kasia Bezorska. Please check the Tesol Kuwait page, click on the tab that says the conference schedule, and that has all the links. That's all you have to do. Now, to receive a certificate, you need to attend 4 presentations. We will not open and admit people after 30 minutes. Okay, so try to be there for that. The certificates will be awarded during the closing ceremony tomorrow evening on Saturday. We hope that you join us for all the other exciting presentations that we have. Thank you again, Scott. Thank you to those who have joined us, and a reminder that by Sunday, inshallah, on Sunday, we will have uploaded the videos from all the keynote speakers and the presenters on our Tesol Kuwait page. It'll be on the conference page, the conference schedule page, also on our Tesol Kuwait YouTube channel. Again, thank you so much for joining us.